Josiah Stoll on the witness stand bears testimony that he had caught a corner of the plates that as they were being handed through the window the night Joseph brought them home. Josiah Stoll said that he could tell through the corner of the little package or the little wrapping that Joseph had them in, that he could tell that there were plates. He described them as having like a greenish hue, which suggests some sort of oxidation, which would make sense if the plates were perhaps an alloy of like copper, bronze, and gold.
Hola a todos, bienvenidos a Viajes de Fe. Y en esta semana vamos a tener un invitado especial que nos va a compartir un poco en cuanto a los testigos del Libro de Mormón. Para los que no lo conozcan, su nombre es Smoot. Esta entrevista va a estar en inglés, así que de igual forma va a estar subtitulada para que nos puedan seguir desde casa. Y pues, sin más que agregar, comencemos. Welcome, Stephen. Thank you for being on the channel today.
Hello, Gustavo. Thank you for having me.
And I was just telling our viewers, well, I just introduced you, but I didn't go into a lot of details. So could you tell us a little bit more about who you are and what you do?
I would be happy to. So I'm originally from Salt Lake City in Utah. I was born and raised as a member of the church with many generations of ancestors, pioneer ancestors who were Latter-day Saints. And you could probably guess, being from Utah, I always had the church growing up around me with the culture and so forth. So as a young man, when I was a teenager, I got very interested in the history of the church and in the teachings of the church. And so I started studying those very closely as a young man, as a teenager. I went on my mission, and after my mission, I went to Brigham Young University, where I studied, my degree was Ancient Near Eastern Studies. So I studied the world of the Bible. Specifically, the Old Testament was my area of academic study. After I graduated from BYU, I went on to work at Book of Mormon Central for a few years, where I was doing research on the Book of Mormon and other aspects of the restoration, but primarily on the Book of Mormon. I left my work at Book of Mormon Central for a time to get my master's degree from the University of Toronto up in Canada. When I finished my degree there in Egyptology, Near and Middle Eastern civilizations, with my concentration being in ancient Egypt, I came back to Book of Mormon Central, worked there for another few years, and left again to go get my doctorate degree, which is what I'm doing right now. So right now I'm doing my doctorate degree in Egyptian and Semitic languages. So I study the Hebrew Old Testament and I study ancient Egypt for my academic work. I'm also an adjunct instructor at Brigham Young University in religious education. So I teach religion classes at Brigham Young University. This semester, for example, I'm teaching Book of Mormon and Pearl of Great Price. So that gives you a sense for the sort of things I teach at BYU. And in addition to all of that, I'm also working for a nonprofit research organization called the B.H. Roberts Foundation. B.H. Roberts was a church historian and a general authority. He died in 1933, so he almost 100 years ago. But he did a lot of great pioneering historical and doctrinal scholarship in the church. And this foundation that I work for is named after him in his honor to sort of carry on his legacy. And in that capacity, I have done a lot of research and writing on aspects of Latter-day Saint history and culture. So I have one foot in Latter-day Saint academic studies. I have another foot in the world of the Bible, studying the world of the Bible, especially the world of the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible. And hopefully that gives you a sense of sort of my my academic backgrounds, right? I'm trying to think what else I can add. I sadly, as you know, I don't speak Spanish. I haven't been to Mexico yet. I hope to visit Mexico sometime. I suppose the closest I've been to Mexico, to your part of the world, Gustavo, is Guatemala, which is, you know, a wonderful country too. Latin America is a great place, but hopefully someday I'll be able to come visit perhaps you and other saints and wonderful people down in Mexico.
Oh, that's great. Well, thank you for sharing that with us. And, you know, when you mentioned, you basically focused on studying the old world, as you mentioned, right? So it's interesting. We could talk about different topics. Maybe we could talk about the Book of Abraham or things like that.
Sure, sometime perhaps. Yes, I recently worked with some co-authors at BYU to publish an issue of the journal. BYU Studies is a academic journal that BYU publishes, and we recently just published an issue of that journal dedicated to studying the Book of Abraham and uncovering questions people have about the Book of Abraham and other aspects of that text in our canon of Scripture. So perhaps a conversation for another time would be Book of Abraham related issues, since I've also written and studied on that as well.
Yeah, and for today, we'll focus on maybe another controversial text, mainly the Book of Mormon.
Sure, we've got plenty of them, right?
Yeah, and now we'll focus maybe not too much on the ancient, but more on the recent
Mhm.
involvement with the Book of Mormon. In this case, the Book of Mormon witnesses.
Sure.
For maybe those of us who watch and aren't too familiar with the witnesses, could you give us a little breakdown of what the witnesses of the Book of Mormon did?
Sure, absolutely. So every single major edition of the Book of Mormon that has been published by the church since 1830, the very first edition published by Joseph Smith, or under his supervision, I should say, every single edition has with it two statements. One is called the testimony of the three witnesses, and the other is called the testimony of the eight witnesses. These are two, you can call them affidavits perhaps, or two testimony statements given by two different groups of men. The three witnesses, Oliver Cowdery, David Whitmer, and Martin Harris, they described having a visionary experience where they were in a vision shown by an angel the plates that Joseph Smith had translated the Book of Mormon from. And so these men described being in a heavenly vision, beholding an angel, that this angel showed them the plates, and more than that, that they heard the voice of God testify to them that the translation of the Book of Mormon that Joseph Smith had produced was true and had been published, or excuse me, had been translated by the power of God. So that's a fairly remarkable experience, right? And you'll see this in every single printed edition of the Book of Mormon published by the church. Now, in addition to that, you have another statement called the testimony of the eight witnesses. This is by, I'll pull up the names here because there's eight of them, more than three. Christian, Jacob, Peter, and John Whitmer, so four members of the Whitmer family, and three of Joseph Smith's family members, his father, Joseph Smith Sr., and two of his brothers, Hiram Smith and Samuel Smith, and then a final person named Hiram Page. These eight individuals testified that they held in their hands and were shown the plates that Joseph Smith had translated, and that they were able to examine them, that they saw the characters on the plates, that the characters looked like they were ancient and well done, well engraven, I mean, and they matter-of-factly described having handled and seen the plates. But they don't mention an angel, they don't mention a vision, anything like that. And so these two statements have gone together, and these individuals, their testimonies have gone out with the Book of Mormon to everybody who reads the Book of Mormon. It's interesting because these statements from these witnesses is like the official piece of evidence, I suppose, that comes with the Book of Mormon, that the Book of Mormon is true. Of course, Latter-day Saints, even going back to Joseph Smith's day, have been very interested in trying to find evidence for the Book of Mormon and analyzing the Book of Mormon with scholarly tools. But this is the only piece of evidence that I suppose you could say the Lord gives us with the Book of Mormon are the statements of these men. And so that's what the statements are. That's why they are significant. And that's why you see them when you read the Book of Mormon. You'll find them in your edition of the Book of Mormon when you pick it up.
Okay, thank you for sharing that. And when we talk about the Book of Mormon witnesses, as you mentioned, is sort of an evidence. If what they say is true, then that makes the Book of Mormon also true.
Right.
So when we look at each of these statements and at each individual witness, some people can maybe look at it skeptically
Mm-hmm.
and for different reasons. One of these reasons are, as you mentioned, there's like out of the 11 witnesses, I think 5 of them belong to the Whitmer family, correct? And
4 of them, yeah.
okay, and the other ones come from Joseph Smith's family, and and there's Martin, who was his scribe for a moment.
Mhm.
So when we look at that, some people can say, well, that's a bit too convenient. They know each
Mhm.
other, they're friends. So the fact that they are testifying that Joseph really was translating an ancient record might be not so convincing. So what are your
Right.
thoughts on that?
That's a great observation that many people have made. The American writer Mark Twain, who wrote Huckleberry Finn, right? One of the most famous American novelists. He once did an analysis of the Book of Mormon, and he sarcastically mentioned the fact that so many Whitmers had testified of the Book of Mormon, and he made the quip, I wouldn't be more satisfied if the entire Whitmer family had testified of the Book of Mormon, right? So people, precisely as you say, Gustavo, people have noticed this. There's a few things I think we should keep in mind as we look at who acted as witnesses and why so many of them are related. So the first, let's talk about the Whitmers, right? So besides David Whitmer, one of the 3 witnesses, you also have Jacob Whitmer, Peter Whitmer, John Whitmer, and Christian Whitmer. They're all also brothers, and David Whitmer. So I guess you do have 5. Between the 3 and the 8, you got 5 Whitmers. Well, I think there's an easy enough sort of answer for that. And probably the most obvious answer for why there are so many Whitmers is Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery were living at the Whitmer farm when they finished the translation of the Book of Mormon in Fayette, New York. So the history goes after Joseph left from Manchester, New York, down where his family farm is, to Harmony, Pennsylvania, where his wife, Emma Smith, that's where she was from and where her family lived, and he lived with his in-laws for a while. They left Harmony, Pennsylvania, and came up to Fayette, New York, which is east of Manchester or Palmyra, New York. And that's where the Whitmers lived. So it makes sense why he would have so many Whitmers, because he was living with them. And if you need to find people to show these plates to have them testify that you have them, it would make sense that you would go to the people that you're living with, who are the closest people nearby that you find who are supporters, right? So understandably, right, many of Joseph Smith's neighbors and people that knew him were very skeptical about his story. Several tried to steal the plates from him. We have reports of attempts to steal the plates, right? A lot of hostility towards Joseph Smith. So to me, it makes sense that he would pick several of the Whitmers to have this experience because they were the ones who were supporting him, that he was living with. So there's the practical consideration for why so many of the Whitmers were chosen. But what about the Smiths? So what about his dad and his brother and his brother? Again, yeah, it's a good point to mention that, they are family members, and that might be suspicious to some people. However, I don't think it necessarily has to be suspicious, right? Just the fact that they're family members in and of itself, I don't think disqualifies their testimony. Certainly, it might raise an eyebrow for some people, but I think you have to take the testimonies on their own merits, because Hiram and Samuel Smith, they gave additional statements throughout their lives. They both died in 1844 at the same time as Joseph Smith did. Hiram, of course, died with Joseph at the Carthage jail, and Samuel died about a month later. But before they died, they both individually left other accounts of their experience handling the plates, right, and bearing testimony of the Book of Mormon. I also think, again, like with the Whitmers, it's understandable why Joseph would want to show family members, because his family were supportive from the beginning of his claims to having gold plates and having seen an angel, right? I think you might be able to compare it somewhat with the witnesses for Christ's resurrection in the New Testament. So if you look at the fact that many of Jesus's earliest disciples, including the apostles that he chooses and he shows himself to after his resurrection, many of them are related to each other. Some of them are brothers, right? So they're part of the same family. And so you have an interesting parallel there. I see that as even perhaps deliberate in some way. So I understand why people wonder, they may raise an eyebrow, the fact that there's so many Whitmers and Smiths here. But that I don't think intrinsically refutes the reality of their experience or the reliability of their testimony. It just makes it so that we have to pause for a moment and look more carefully about who these people were and try to find out more about them individually to see if they maintained their testimonies individually as opposed to collectively as a group. And the answer is yes to both, right? So both as a group, they affirmed their testimony, but each individual also gave independent corroborative testimony to what they had experienced. And so perhaps that helps us make some sense about why we have who we have as the witnesses to the Book of Mormon.
Okay, thank you for sharing that. And when we talk about the witnesses, as you mentioned, one of the main criticisms is why are they all related, right? And as we move on from that, I think that there's also a very fair criticism, or not criticism, but question. Because when, I don't know, here in Mexico, for example, for the Catholic religion, there's the Virgin Mary of Guadalupe. I don't know if you heard of it.
Sure,
And
yeah.
there's also the, Juan Diego, a witness of the vision. And when we look at, I don't know, maybe the 80s, there's many people who claim to see aliens or spaceships. So
Sure.
there are witnesses that can testify of pretty much anything. So what makes the witnesses of the Book of Mormon any different?
Another great question. Absolutely. You have people who will say they've witnessed many miraculous experiences or supernatural experiences. There's a couple of things I would say we need to consider. The first is that just because somebody claims they saw something that perhaps we don't believe or might sound crazy, that doesn't instinctively negate other testimonies or other claims that people have made about other incidences. In other words, you have to take each claim on their own, right? You have to take each eyewitness testimony and critically analyze it by itself. So just broadly saying that people have claimed to see all sorts of things, well, that's true as a matter of fact. Of course, people have claimed to see many things. But that in and of itself doesn't necessarily negate what others may have seen, if that makes sense. So that's the first thing just sort of to consider, I believe. The second thing to consider is to look at individually the corroborative testimonies that these men gave over their lifetimes independent of each other, okay? So if, for example, if we want to say that there was a big conspiracy between all the witnesses, they got together and they hatched up this plot or this conspiracy to make up this thing that they said they saw. Okay, you might be able to argue that if you just have the statement that we have in the Book of Mormon, right? But these men lived at different times. They separated from each other. Some of them lived into their old age. Others died when they were much younger. And we have a very strong documentary record from each, well, not necessarily all of them, but from many of them, we have independent firsthand statements that they gave where they reaffirmed the details of their experience. And overall, those accounts are consistent with each other, right? And so it's interesting to me to see the fact that this seems to negate, I believe, the chances of they were conspiring with one another. Because if that were so, once they were dying off, or once they were going their separate ways, you would perhaps expect their stories to contradict each other, or that they would begin to no longer be consistent. But overall, they are, I would say. That's just sort of offhand is what comes to my thinking when I look at the statements made by the witnesses versus others who claim miraculous experiences. Now, I don't want to necessarily say that those who have seen the Virgin Mary of Guadalupe, right, that they must be lying or they must be crazy. I honestly don't know because I haven't evaluated their specific testimonies. My understanding is in most of the cases, these other claimed experiences, it's the single person claiming it for themselves, right? And there's no other way to perhaps corroborate what they say they experienced. I suspend judgment, personal judgment in a lot of these cases just because I haven't looked at them very closely. But when you have multiple eyewitnesses over a span of decades who are telling a consistent story with one another about this experience, that gives me some reassurance that this is a credible experience or this is a credible account that I'm reading. And it's not just me now. Historians, including non-Latter-day Saint historians, who sincerely and carefully look at the statements left behind by the Book of Mormon witnesses, they're coming around to acknowledge that these men must have had some kind of an experience that led them to sincerely believe this had happened to them, right? So even if you don't want to necessarily believe that they saw an angel or handled gold plates, I know several non-Latter-day Saint historians who have said in print, in academic journals and books, they say perhaps they discovered a local Indian relic, or perhaps Joseph Smith had found printing plates for like printing books that he showed them. They had some kind of tangible physical experience with an object in the real world based on how compelling their testimony is. So there, of course, is still room for faith for everybody individually if they want to believe the story or not and how much they believe. But I don't think we can dismiss their testimony offhand just because other people have had miraculous claims or they've claimed they've seen miraculous or supernatural things. It really does come down to taking each account and evaluating it on its own merits and seeing how it stacks up under scrutiny. And I believe for the Book of Mormon witnesses, they withstand scrutiny very well.
Okay, and you were mentioning that even scholars who aren't members of the church have come around to see that something must have happened. Maybe if not an angel on the plates, something must have happened. And with the something else, maybe an alternative that people can offer, I've heard Steve Pinecker from Mormon Book Reviews or Dan Vogel explain how they think this went about. And for example, as you mentioned, the 3 witnesses saw an angel and the plates, and the 8 witnesses handled the plates. So maybe I don't know, the alternative or maybe more realistic explanation for both is that maybe the 3 witnesses had maybe a born-again experience. Maybe they were too excited with Joseph that it was just maybe they were all excited and they had this experience. And at the other hand, we see that they claim to handle something. And there's this idea that maybe Joseph could have created tin plates since it wasn't very expensive, as some people claim. So how much credibility do those explanations have for you?
That's a great question. I have to respect these alternative theories to a degree because they are trying to honestly reckon with the historical evidence. It used to be that people were saying they were just dismissing offhand these claims that these men were making. Oh, they're just lying, right? That was usually what you were hearing in anti-Mormon literature from the past. Serious historians and people, skeptics and critics like Dan Vogel, who are at least trying to do good, serious history, they at least take these men seriously enough to engage them on their own terms, right? So let's start with the tin plates, for example. Dan Vogel has argued for this. Even Fawn Brody back in the 1940s suggested perhaps Joseph Smith had fabricated a set of plates to show the witnesses for them to handle. I suppose if you are determined not to accept the reality of ancient gold plates given to Joseph Smith by an angel, and you need any alternative or substitute, I suppose that one works fine if you want to go there. However, it should be noted that people like Martin Harris, even they were adamant that Joseph would not have been able to fabricate something like this. So Martin Harris gave an interview, he gave several interviews throughout his life, and in one of them, he was asked this question, right, whether Joseph Smith could have fabricated a set of plates to show Martin or for Martin to feel. And Martin sort of wryly said, before he saw them with the angel, he just hefted them covered in a box or in a sack. He said, when I hefted them, I determined they must have been about 50 or 60 pounds of either lead or gold, and I knew Joseph didn't have that much credit for lead, right? In other words, Martin Harris knew Joseph Smith did not, according to him, did not have the means to fabricate a set of fake plates out of, say, lead or out of tin. And so I think the tin plates theory runs into the problem of even Joseph Smith's contemporaries who knew Joseph Smith did not think he was capable of fabricating a set of tin plates. Partly or mainly because they knew that Joseph Smith did not have the economic means to be able to do such. The other problem that I have with the tin plates theory is the way that the 8 witnesses describe the construction of the plates. So they describe the construction of the plates as being done professionally. They describe the engravings on the plates as being beautiful, as having been rendered with skill and artistry, right? So it seems like, well, I'll admit this is just my impression from what I know of Joseph Smith from having studied his life. It doesn't seem like Joseph Smith would have had the wherewithal to fake a set of plates that would have been convincing enough to the people handling them to make them seem like they were ancient and that they were made by professional ancient scribes, right? Or ancient metallurgists, I suppose. So that's another problem that I have with it, sort of offhand. And then there's a final problem, is it's not just plates you have to fabricate if you're Joseph Smith. You also have to fabricate a pair of spectacles, Urim and Thummim, that you need to have other people handle. So Joseph Smith's mom, for example, describes handling the Urim and Thummim, the spectacles, under a handkerchief when Joseph brought them home to the family, right? You also have to account for the fact that David Whitmer said that in their visionary experience, they also beheld the Liahona and the Urim and Thummim and the Sword of Laban. So you have to have, I guess, Joseph Smith make up those too. It seems like you just have to add to your list of things for Joseph Smith to fabricate, and it gets sort of out of hand at that point. So that's another sort of hesitation I have with that theory. So that's on that side of things. In terms of the experience of the 3 witnesses, so you're wondering, and others have wondered, right? Perhaps they had a born-again experience. We would probably say they had a bout of religious enthusiasm, right? They all got together in a heightened sense of religious mindset, and that sort of led them to think they had a vision. You know, visions by sort of definition are otherworldly, so it's hard to always know exactly what are the nature of visionary experiences. But one thing that I think we can say is my understanding is that this idea of group hallucinations, where people can hallucinate the same thing at the same time, isn't really possible in humans, since it's all happening in our brains and everybody has a different brain. Unless if there is an external objective thing they're viewing, it doesn't seem to me like the 3 witnesses could have simultaneously had the same religious enthusiastic experience, let's say, and it just so happens that they all saw the same thing. This to me lends me to believe that there was an external object or agent that in this visionary context they all could see at the same time, namely the angel and the plates. Even though, of course, it was visionary, so it was otherworldly in a sense, right? It was grounded in an objective reality that they together were experiencing. So that's where I see the difference between, let's say, other groups who get in heightened religious mindsets or religious imagination, right? Versus what happens with the 3 witnesses. I see an appreciable difference there from when I compare and contrast them.
Okay, thank you for sharing that, Stephen. And you talk about this angel experience and this physical experience that the 8 witnesses had. You also mentioned Joseph's mother and how she handled the spectacles. So, do we know of any other people who had a close encounter with the plates or with any of those objects?
Yes, good question. We do. We know of several people who reported having a tangible physical interaction with these objects that Joseph Smith said he had gotten from an angel. So just sort of running down the list, for example, let's go to the Smith family, Joseph Smith's siblings and his parents. So Joseph's wife, Emma, she very famously describes tracing the outline of the plates as they were under a cloth, that she could feel with her fingers, that it felt like pages of a book when she rifled through them. She described how they would lay wrapped in a cloth on the table, and while she was doing her house chores, she would have to move them aside, right, in order to clean the house. So we have Emma that describes having a physical interaction with them. I mentioned Joseph's mother. She describes in her memoirs, her history written in 1844, right after Joseph Smith dies, She describes handling the spectacles under a handkerchief that Joseph had handed to her so that she could feel and examine them. We also have others who reported, so they met with Lucy and they talked to her, and they said that Lucy told them that she had also handled the plates but hadn't seen them. William Smith, Joseph's brother, he lived for a long time, and he left accounts of handling the plates just like Emma did, just like his mom did. He describes them being like in a pillowcase, for example, that Joseph brought them home in September of 1827, and he had them wrapped in a pillowcase that he kept in the house, and William described handling them. William had a sister named Catherine Smith. She, not herself necessarily, but a descendant, so like grandchildren, for example, they left accounts of hearing from grandma describing to them that she had had experiences handling the plates, just like William, just like Emma, just like Sydney, right? So that's just within the family. We have mom, we have dad, who's a witness. We have two brothers who are witnesses, official witnesses. We have another brother who's an unofficial witness who describes handling them. We have a sister who told family members about handling them. So that's just within the family, right? Now, what about neighbors? There's neighbors, people who know Joseph Smith, friends and supporters. So Josiah Stoll, for example, he's a farmer in the area that knows the Smith family. Joseph Smith goes to work for Josiah Stoll. His name appears in the Pearl of Great Price in Joseph Smith's history. Joseph Smith describes how he went to help dig for a mine with Josiah Stoll, right, down in Pennsylvania. Josiah Stoll is brought up as a witness in a court case in 1830 when Joseph Smith is being charged as a disorderly person because of his visionary claims and his claims to being a seer, to having a stone that he can use to see miraculous things. And Josiah Stoll on the witness stand bears testimony that he had caught a corner of the plates that as they were being handed through the window the night Joseph brought them home. Josiah Stoll so that he could tell through the corner of the little package or the little wrapping that Joseph had them in, that he could tell that there were plates. He described them as having like a greenish hue, which suggests some sort of oxidation, which would make sense if the plates were perhaps an alloy of like copper, bronze, and gold. So Josiah Stoll is one who leaves a testimony. We have others. These are more sort of hearsay accounts from neighbors, so they aren't as direct, but we know Alva Beeman is another neighbor. Actually, he's down in, I believe, in Harmony, but he's maybe in Manchester. I can't recall. But Alva Beeman is another neighbor, we'll say, who reportedly handled the plates as they were wrapped, right? So you can go down the list of people who describe these experiences. Many Latter-day Saints are probably familiar with the story of Mary Whitmer. So Mary Whitmer is the mother, the mother of David and John and Christian and Peter and Jacob, the other official witnesses. And there's a family tradition within the Whitmer family. It's recorded by at least a few of her children who give different accounts of Mary not only seeing the plates uncovered, but having them shown to her by an angel. So the most famous version of the story is that when Joseph and Oliver were translating in Fayette at the Whitmer farm, that Mary was really put out by the fact that she was now taking care of a lot of people in their small farmhouse. And you probably know, if you have a crowded little farm with lots of people living in it, you have lots of chores and lots of dirty stuff to clean. And the most famous account of the story from the Whitmer family goes that as Mary was doing this, so she was grumbling and complaining about all the chores she had to do, an older man came to her. He had a knapsack on his back, and he took off the knapsack and he pulled out the plates and he showed her, right, the plates. And so this, seems to be the angel Moroni, perhaps in disguise in some way, or who knows exactly. But we have this account from Mary that's famously in our church records. I believe Mary Whitmer shows up in Volume 1 of Saints. If you and others have read Saints Volume 1, right, they retell her story. So this is all to say we have the statements from the people in the Book of Mormon, the 3 and the 8 witnesses. We also have several, again, myself and others call them unofficial witnesses, meaning people who just matter-of-factly described a tactile, tangible experience with these objects. That is one of the key pieces of evidence that leads historians to think, including non-LDS historians, to think Joseph Smith must have had some object that he was showing people or that people were interacting with. It's not at all as simple to say he just made it up, it was all in his mind, and everybody was either just lying or crazy. When you get that many people who, independent of each other, are telling the same or a similar story, that's when you have to start taking it seriously as a historian, right? So those are sort of the unofficial witnesses of the Book of Mormon. To me, it's really interesting that a lot of these individuals are women. So we have accounts from Emma, from Lucy, right, from Mary. I find that significant because none of the official witnesses are women. They're all men. And there may be some specific reasons for that, which we could go into. But the fact that several women talked about this, having these experiences, that to me, as I said, I find significant. Both as a Latter-day Saint who believes in the truthfulness of the Book of Mormon, but also as one who studies early Latter-day Saint history and the coming forth of the Book of Mormon. I think it is not at all controversial to say, Gustavo, that Joseph Smith had a physical object that he was showing others and they were handling and seeing, right? If you don't want to believe Joseph Smith and you want to say he made up a set of tin plates, okay, you could perhaps argue that. I don't think it's a very persuasive argument, but that is more supported by the historical sources than saying he simply made it up, he was simply lying, or it was all hallucinatory. It was all just in his head because he was crazy, right? It was all imaginary. So that's the combined weight of both the official and the unofficial witnesses. That's what you get from that. And I find it very compelling and remarkable.
I see. And now as we wrap up, I just want to play devil's advocate for a minute.
Please, yeah.
And I'm just trying to see this from a very skeptical point of view.
Sure,
Sometimes I like to do this, not because I doubt, but because it's interesting for me to see other points of view.
Sure, absolutely.
So as we talk about the witnesses, many of the things that I've heard, and I will just focus on a couple of criticisms. One of them is that especially the three witnesses are not maybe as reliable. Maybe they're not trustworthy people. When we look, for example, Hiram Page, I think that a few years later he was trying to receive revelations on a stone, right? And Joseph had to put an end to it.
That's right.
And we look at Martin, and there's this famous account that Martin had all sort of visions, all sort of experiences, that he even saw Christ as a deer, and he was walking with him one time. And yeah, many people look at Martin and look at a gullible person. If you look at the South Park episode, when he's like, Joseph, my wife took the plates and the transcript, and you need to translate again. Oh, Martin, God is so angry at me. We need to do it again, but with different words.
Wow.
When we look at David Whitmer, for example, he had this account, and I'll just paraphrase it. But he said that he saw an angel and told him to step away from the Latter-day Saints. And he says, if you believe I saw an angel who showed me the plains, then you should believe that I also saw this angel who told me to step away from the Latter-day Saints. So we looked at these people kind of maybe contradict or aren't as reliable as we think, maybe are gullible. Others, I've heard this, I know there are really not many or any sources to back it up, but I've heard many people say that everyone said, oh, I'm sorry, I lied, and just rejected their testimonies, maybe on their deathbed or years later. So when we look at that, and maybe it's no longer maybe questioning the nature of what happened, but just the people themselves. So I mentioned a lot of things.
Sure, no, that's fine.
What do you think about those criticisms?
So individually, we could go one by one if we would like. Perhaps we wouldn't like to at the time that we have, but the bigger point that you're sort of getting at that I can address is, as you said, overall, are the reputations and the characters of these persons reliable, right? Are they believable? Were they gullible? Were they superstitious? Were they easily persuadable, right? That has, for a lot of church history, that has been the tactic of many anti-Mormons, is to depict the witnesses as either liars, okay, so they were in on it with Joseph Smith, to depict them as superstitious, they were just stupid and would believe any crazy thing, as gullible, right, they could easily be tricked by somebody like Joseph Smith, or perhaps having some sort of ulterior motive, right, they were in it for money, they were in it for prestige, right. One by one, historians have gone through and have critically analyzed each of these portrayals of the witnesses that you get in past predominantly anti-Mormon works, right? Predominantly, this is the portrait you get from people who have a vested interest to make their testimony go away and to make it unbelievable, right? I think that each of these fall individually, these attempts to characterize the witnesses in these ways. So we know the lives of these men very well because many of them are well documented, right? And the individual points that people have used to try to make this argument, I don't think withstand scrutiny. To the point where, going back, sort of related to my earlier statement, non-Latter-day Saint historians who look at the witnesses now grant them their basic sincerity and their basic honesty and their basic sanity, right? You are not going to find credible historians either in or out of the church who will try to portray the witnesses the way that past anti-Mormons tried to portray them as either gullible, as either liars, as either idiots. Across the board, the new biographies and the new histories being written by these men and others portray the witnesses as having basic sincerity, basic honesty, basic sanity, right? And so individually, you each raised these different points that people have made or claims people have said about the witnesses. And one by one, I have seen them fall by the wayside because the evidence for these portrayals aren't very good. Let me give you just one example, and I have to use it just because it's the most easiest one to refute. So the claim is made that Martin Harris said that he once saw Jesus in a vision in the form of a deer, right, as he was walking through the woods. Well, if that's true, then it looks like Martin Harris was a pretty gullible person or a superstitious person who was having all sorts of crazy visions about things. Well, that claim specifically, Martin Harris said he saw Jesus as a deer. It's not a first-hand account. It's not Martin Harris saying this. It's not a second-hand account. It's not somebody saying they heard Martin say it. It is an anonymous third-hand account that's preserved in an anti-Mormon book from 1840. In other words, it's an anti-Mormon writer claiming he heard it from an unnamed anonymous source, claiming he heard it from Martin Harris. Now, that is just not, and that's the only source that says this. There's no other source that talks about Martin Harris seeing Jesus as a deer. So credible, serious historians don't take that at face value because it's a bad source, right? We can't prove if it did or didn't happen. It's just a claim. It's a very hearsay rumor claim, right? So you go down the list of all these different things people have tried to say about the witnesses, and in my judgment, they don't hold up very well. So that I think we can have confidence that these men had their basic honesty and decency and sanity, right? And sincerity as well. That's the other big thing that historians really emphasize is these men are very sincere when they describe these experiences that they had, right? And so sincerity doesn't prove that it happened, of course, right? But it does help us, I think, take them more credibly or take them more seriously because sincere people are more likely to endure persecution, which many of the witnesses did. And sincere people are more likely to be honest in trying to honestly tell what happened to them and not trying to contrive a story, not trying to perpetuate a fraud, something like that. And so that would be my response to your bigger question here. And I encourage your listeners to rely on the historical scholarship that is published in peer-reviewed books and journals, not things perhaps they hear on the internet or that they get from different, YouTube videos or whatever, because the credible historians, or I should say the professionally trained historians, very widely agree on this about the witnesses.
Okay, thank you. And as we talk about it from a maybe a historian point of view and look at different naturalistic explanations for their experiences, this last question is maybe a bit more subjective,
Mhm.
but why do you consider the testimony of these 11 witnesses compelling?
That's the $1 million question, isn't it? Right? Why is it compelling overall? For me, it's two things. The first is that I have tried to very carefully analyze the lives of these men, and I have very carefully looked over the records they left of their experience. So, for example, part of my work with the B.H. Roberts Foundation, I actually published an article on the Book of Mormon witnesses, or I should say, I was the researcher on an article that was published by the B.H. Roberts Foundation on the Book of Mormon witnesses. And as part of my research on those witnesses, I compiled and analyzed, and they're available on the website. I'll send the link that you can post perhaps in the comments or in the description for anybody that's interested. I was able to look at and compile over 250 primary sources related to these guys, right? Now, that's not all of them. There's still some sources I'm trying to hunt down the originals for to put in our database, but over 250 of them. And I don't know what to tell you other than when I look at it, I see a compelling account of what these men experienced, right? What is really compelling to me, like I said earlier in our discussion, is the fact that they are independently corroborating the account over the span of decades, right? So it's not a one and done deal. Oh, they gave their testimony in the Book of Mormon, and that was it. They never said anything else about it ever again. On the contrary, men like David Whitmer gave dozens and dozens of interviews and loved to talk to people about his experience with the Book of Mormon and with the plates and seeing the angel. And just David Whitmer alone, we have a very rich documentary record from him affirming what he experienced. So on the historical grounds, I find it compelling just because we have so much rich documentation about what they experienced, right? Now, of course, we still have questions. There's some uncertain things. I'm not claiming that we have everything down, that we know everything. But overall, it is a credible and believable account. That's on the historical side of things. On the personal side of things, I just frankly have to say, as a believer, as somebody who has a testimony of this, having encountered the Book of Mormon, having encountered their words and the words of the Book of Mormon, I have a spiritual witness or confirmation this is true. So I have a religious or spiritual conviction that this is true, right? And I admit that that's a bias that I have that not everybody shares. I'm fine with that. But that is a conviction that I have that I feel is very well grounded on the documentary evidence. It is well grounded on the facts we know about these men and what they experienced, right? So for me, it's the 1-2 punch. It's the historical aspect and it's the spiritual aspect have come together for me personally to convince me that these men told the truth. I suppose if I had to quickly add a third thing, it would be that I have looked at the counter arguments. I have read Dan Vogel's books and his articles. I've looked at others. He's not the only one. Many, many people have given skeptical counter arguments for why their testimony is not reliable. And I sincerely don't think that they have given a counter explanation that can account for the evidence as well as the faithful explanation is, right? And so until somebody can give me a counter explanation that accounts for the evidence as well as the faithful narrative does, I have to stick with the faithful narrative, both out of intellectual honesty and from my spiritual conviction I have about this. So this all comes together for me to think the Book of Mormon witnesses are very credible, very believable, and it is, frankly, it's delightful to study the lives of these men and what they experienced. Because my faith is reaffirmed that what they experience is true.
Perfect, Stephen. Thank you so much for sharing that. Thank you for sharing what you've studied and learned throughout the years about these people. And you mentioned some sources and things that people can look into if they want to know a scholar's point of view. So do you have many books or websites or anything like that that people can look into if they're more interested on the subject?
Absolutely. I'll be happy to give a few recommendations, and I'll pass along the links where your listeners can pursue them for themselves. Unfortunately, most of them are in English, I have to say, so I'm sorry about that for all of your Spanish-speaking listeners. So, number one, there's the book by Richard Lloyd Anderson, published in 1981, I want to say, perhaps 83, Investigating the Book of Mormon Witnesses. That is still today, it holds up very well, even though it was written, almost over 40 years ago now, right? It holds up very well with the amount of research Richard Lloyd Anderson did into the witnesses. His book is a must-read. There's a book that came out recently through Oxford University Press titled The Book of Mormon, A Documentary History by Larry Morris. Larry Morris is a historian who compiled most, but not all, but most of the primary sources related to the coming forth of the Book of Mormon, and he has 2 chapters on the 3 and the 8 witnesses. And so Larry Morris's book is very good if you want the sources for yourself, as well as Larry Morris's commentary. There's articles by Stephen Harper, one of my colleagues in religious education at BYU. Stephen Harper teaches church history and doctrine. Stephen Harper also worked on the Joseph Smith papers, and he has published on the experiences of the Book of Mormon witnesses, and he has addressed many of the questions people have. There's other articles, right? There's articles done by some of my BYU colleagues on the experiences of the women who handled Book of Mormon plates and other related artifacts, right? We mentioned all the women that had these experiences. So those are some books and some articles I can recommend. For websites, this is very shameless because I helped write it, but the B.H. Roberts Foundation on the website mormoner.org, so mormonr.org, and I'll share the link. We have an article on the witnesses. It's a Q&A article. It's not very long, and it has many of the primary sources, over 200 of them, 250 of them, that your readers can, or your listeners can read for free. Fair Mormon is another apologetic organization that has done some great work answering a lot of the questions people have about the Book of Mormon witnesses. Book of Mormon Central has videos and articles on the Book of Mormon witnesses, and I'll be happy to share all of those. So, and I believe the Book of Mormon Central has translated most of all their material into Spanish. And so I'll even be happy to share links to the Spanish website the Book of Mormon Central has done, which would probably be helpful for your listeners. So there's no shortage of wonderful resources out there that I recommend for people to really sink their teeth into the Book of Mormon witnesses in order to understand them and to know what they experienced and to study for themselves.
All right, perfect. So yeah, I'll make sure to add the links so any of our listeners and viewers can read them if they're interested. And thank you so much, Stephen, for being here. Do you have any last words before we finish?
I don't think so. Just thank you for having me on your show. It was great to talk with you, Gustavo. I appreciate it. And it was great talking with you. So thank you.
Thank you for being here. Y para todos ustedes que vieron este video, muchas gracias por verlo. Gracias por escucharnos también. Si les gusta, pueden compartirlo, pueden darle me gusta, pueden suscribirse al canal, pueden seguirnos en Facebook o escucharnos en Spotify. Y al final, recuerden, el propósito de los invitados, de las historias, es simplemente que el viaje de cada uno de nosotros sea más informado.